Hi everyone. This is the first video for our course and it's meant to prepare you for class on Tuesday, September 10th. So this coming Tuesday. And I'm going to be sort of going through with you in this video for about 20 minutes Lewis Poyman's analysis of arguments for and against relativism and for objectivism. So these are views about the status or nature of morality, whether moral principles are relative to different cultures, communities, societies, or whether there is an independent standard of right and wrong against which we compare and critique different practices in different cultures and within our own culture or community. Couple of practical things. First of all, when you come to class, I want you to have watched this video, so Tuesday's class, watch this video, which sort of helps you, reminds you of what's going on in the reading. So you need to have done the reading as well, which is Poyman, and that's indicated on your syllabus. For the date of the class meeting, you'll see that Poyman's last name is given, and that's the reading, which is also labeled on Blackboard under the last name, under Poyman. And you'll see that under the readings tab on Blackboard. So do the reading, watch this video. You'll also see on Blackboard outlines that go with the videos. So you can follow along while you're listening to me right now on the outline, and you can use that to keep track of what I'm saying, but also to structure any notes that you're making, okay? Also, finally, on a practical note, all the videos, once they've been posted, which will be week by week, will remain available for the rest of the semester so that you can always go back, rewatch something, and check your understanding of a particular issue or topic. All right, so first, relativism. What is it? What is the position known as relativism, as a philosophical position about the nature of value, moral value? I've given a kind of brief characterization at the toward the top of your handout, so I'll just read that. According to relativism, a harmful act is right, morally right, if the perpetrator, person carrying out the action, claims that it is right. So they think it's fine, whatever they're doing. It's right for them. It's morally acceptable for them to do it. But let's say there's an onlooker who's watching this other person carry out some action, and they're outraged and they think the action is morally impermissible. That would make it wrong for them to do that action, for the onlooker to do the same action that they find impermissible. But it doesn't make it wrong for the perpetrator to do it if that perpetrator truly thinks that it's right. So it's right according to the perpetrator, for the perpetrator. It's wrong, morally wrong, according to the onlooker, for the onlooker. It's not wrong for the perpetrator to carry out the act just because the onlooker thinks it's wrong. The onlooker has no authority over the perpetrator as to what is right or wrong for that other person. Okay, so that is relativism. That was a bit of a filled out version of the characterization given on your handout. So Poyman, as you'll see in the reading, focuses on a form of relativism that he calls conventionalism. He quickly dismisses another form which he calls individualism or individualistic relativism for its supposed incoherence, and we can talk about its supposed incoherence in class if we want. Poyman is interested in the kind of relativism that says what makes something right is the beliefs of a particular culture. So if it's right according to a certain group of people, then it really is right for them. Even if there's another group of people who think it's wrong and they have different beliefs about what's in fact morally correct. So he's looking at relativity between cultures, communities, societies, however you define a culture or distinguish a particular culture, community, or society as a kind of value community, which could be ahistorical, it could be historically defined, ethnically defined, regionally defined, so on. There's a standard argument for relativism whereby one arrives at the view known as relativism, a view about the nature of morality, by making some observations about diversity seemingly across cultures and communities and historical time periods in practices, human practices, which have moral relevance and which are considered, and different attitudes that different cultures, communities, etc. have about different practices. So the argument is given on your handout. It has two premises and a conclusion. The premises are the claims that are supposed to follow from one another and then ultimately lead to a conclusion, whereby the conclusion kind of drops out. It's entailed by the premises and thereby fully supported. So the first premise, again, this is on your handout, I'm reading along. Different cultures engage in different social practices and have different attitudes about the permissibility of various practices that have moral relevance. Practices to do with sex and relationships, to do with how you treat other people and do or don't inflict various forms of harm on other people or on other kinds of animals and plant life and ecosystems as well. Different attitude, different practices. Then the second premise says, well, surely it follows from that first premise, this diversity, that in fact cultures and societies have different values. So they take different attitudes on different practices. So that must mean they have fundamentally different values. And then it's supposed to follow the conclusion that relativism is true, that there's no independent standard of right and wrong. It's just a matter of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. That's how I put it on your handout. The conclusion just is a statement of relativism, the position known as relativism. Now, what we like to do in philosophy is assess the structure of arguments to see whether an argument is actually persuasive. And for it to be persuasive, for us to decide to take up the conclusion, it has to be the case that the premises follow one another in the right way, so that one leads to another and to another, and then the conclusion is sort of inevitable. It drops out of a set of claims, some of which we may already know, but we just haven't articulated them. So basic assumptions about the way we live or the way the world is. And some of them may be empirically based. And then you arrive at this often surprising conclusion about the nature of things, what's real, what's not, what's right, what's not right or wrong, what makes a person a person. I mean, there's so many sort of very deep abstract questions on which we have working assumptions to get us through life, but which we can see in philosophy whether in fact they're well supported assumptions and we have the right assumptions to guide us successfully through life as rational creatures, well, semi-rational creatures. So what the philosopher wants to ask about this argument is, does premise 2 in fact follow from premise 1? Is its truth guaranteed by does premise 1 automatically lead to premise 2? Assuming that premise 1 were true, would premise 2 follow? And then does the conclusion automatically follow from premise 2 if premise 2 were true? Okay, so we can have some discussion about this in class, but I'm just gonna raise a couple of issues that suggest a problem or two problems with the structure of the argument. Okay, so first of all, from premise 1 to premise 2, does it follow automatically that diversity in cultural practices and attitudes indicates that there are fundamentally different values in different cultures at different times? Well, no. In any situation where you notice a practice that is different from what you're used to, say, historical or in a certain community that's not yours, say, or sub-community that's not yours, you have to ask, okay, why does that group of people have that practice? And it's not just values that dictate or determine our practices. So take the case of the practice of infanticide in traditional Inuit and Sami communities in the far north, when those communities were nomadic and living in these extreme conditions. It's really cold. Infanticide was a not a exactly common practice, but there were many cases of infanticide. Does that mean that the traditional Inuit and Sami peoples did not value human life? That they did not think it was important to protect and nurture their children and all the sort of younger members of their group? No. I mean, it seems much more plausible, in fact, that infanticide was practiced in a limited way for the survival of the group. If there was a very ill infant that couldn't be taken care of, and that it's being taken care of, it would prevent the group from moving on to a new hunting ground and surviving because they had food, then they'd have to make this horrible decision to sacrifice one life, the infant's, in order to save many lives. I mean, that's a horrible decision to make for the Inuit people or the Sami people, just like it would be for us if we found ourselves in very extreme conditions living nomadically. So there we're looking at the physical circumstances, the kind of choices these people make, where they live, and what they have to do to survive. We can't jump from noticing different practices to claiming that, oh, well, the Inuit have fundamentally different values than us. They think murder's okay. Or a community which practices parricide, where elderly people are, say, left to die of exposure. Do they have fundamentally different values? Well, we can't decide that until we've ruled out various sort of practical considerations, historical, social considerations that might dictate the practice independently of values. And in fact, it does seem like there's going to have to be some values that every community holds for that community to survive. So if the Inuit didn't value their children, so they just, let them out to play in the snow with the polar bears or something, that the Inuit community, or particular, Inuit community, would not last, right? There'd be no new generation to take over with the hunting and the building of ice houses and whatever. So, you kind of have to care about your kids to have a sustainable community, just like you have to care about telling the truth. That doesn't mean you're always going to, but you think it's important to try. You think telling the truth is good and lying is bad. And if we all care about truth-telling, we can have reasonable confidence that people are going to be telling us the truth when they talk to us. And then we know what's going on, right? We know when we can take action reliably on what someone tells us. Otherwise, if none of us cared about telling the truth, we just said whatever we wanted to say, communication would break down. We'd be unable to make a joint decision or tell someone that they have to do something and give them a reason that makes them do it. Right? It would just be impossible. And without communication, what kind of community could you sustain? Right? So there seem to be certain things that we just have to care about: honesty and the preservation of human life, the protection of young people, in order to have these communities at all, which we do have. So that's worth keeping in mind. The possibility for there being shared values despite diversity across cultures in practices. And what we'll see with Poyman is that he's going to take that insight and use it as an argument for objectivism, for there being objective moral values, an independent standard of right and wrong, independent from any particular time and place that we refer to, and we hope to discover when we decide whether it's okay to do something or not in our own culture or someone else's. Okay, so that was considering the move from premise 1 to premise 2, diversity in practices different moral values. Now, what about the move from different moral values, premise 2, to the conclusion, which is relativism? Relativism is true. That's, right and wrong is just a matter of opinion. Different cultures have different opinions for whatever reason, anthropologically, there you go. Well, the problem here is that premise 2 is an empirical claim about what people happen to believe is right or wrong. So you could sort of, it would be a very difficult study to do, but if you could go around the world at a particular point in history and sort of ask people, do you think this is okay? Do you think that's okay? Do you think it's okay to kill, to sacrifice, is it okay to steal in general? Is it okay to have premarital sex? And write it all down and be like, oh, well, this group of people think it's wrong to have premarital sex, and they might have all kinds of reasons. And this group thinks, in general, as a rule, although there may be exceptions, and in general, as a rule, it's bad to steal. And this group thinks, in general, as a rule, it's okay, or there isn't a rule about not stealing. So, oh, look, people have different beliefs. Interesting. Even if that were true, and as I just mentioned, it is debatable. Even if that were true, it doesn't follow that relativism is true. Because the conclusion, relativism, that position, it's a position about how things really are, about morality being relative, the nature of reality. What people happen to believe is right or wrong, that's a different kind of claim than what is in fact right or wrong, or how morality works. So you can't get from a claim about, oh, this person believes this and this person believes that, to a claim about what really is the case, right? So this is a logical point about the structure of the argument. The conclusion does not drop out of these premises. They might be good premises, or at least one of them might be a good premise, but you need more. You need to fill this argument in if you're going to get to this conclusion, which is relativism. And it turns out it's very difficult to get to the conclusion that sort of directly with positive claims like these premises, to the conclusion that relativism is true, that morality is relative, and that's the case, that's what morality is. So what you sort of have to end up doing is taking an indirect route. You, as a relativist, you could respond to some common objections to relativism, which Poyman rehearses. That would be one way to so you're not exactly positively proving relativism, but you're keeping it alive as a viable position. That's generally where people end up. So we'll talk about that. Before we do, Poyman does give, and this is on your outline, he does give an argument for tolerance entailing relativism. So the idea is, this is on your handout, where is it? The idea is that we are committed to being tolerant of differences in the way people live in different cultures and across time. If we're going to make sense of that commitment, it must be the case that relativism is true. Otherwise, there's no justification for tolerance. And assuming that we're committed to it, we want a justification for it. So the argument goes as follows. If morality is relative to its culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any culture but one's own. If there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Morality is relative to its culture, therefore we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So to get to a defense of tolerance, that we ought to be tolerant, the conclusion, we have to accept relativism. It has to be the case that relativism is true. Now, Poyman raises a basic objection to this argument, and you will probably remember this from your reading. It's a circular argument because it's sort of assuming something that we're supposed to be concluding in order to get to the conclusion. So it's assuming that tolerance is something that we all care about and ought to care about, to get to the conclusion that we ought to be tolerant. There are supposed to be no universal right and wrong principles according to relativism, right? But premise 2 is saying that if there's no independent standard, then we ought to be tolerant. But that suggests that the we here is everyone. Tolerance is a fixed principle that stays in place regardless of time and place, across cultures or between cultures. But there are supposed to be no such principles. So we can't sort of rely on tolerance being universal and appeal to relativism to justify tolerance, because that would be to deny relativism. So we're just sort of going around in a circle, tolerance, relativism, tolerance, relativism. I mean, many people understandably they value tolerance. They don't want to be too quick to criticize practices across cultures because they want to be respectful of different practices, different cultures, and the different reasons people have for having different practices. But the thing is, you can be respectful of a culture in general while rejecting certain practices. And to be tolerant, you need to have views about some things being okay and some things not. And then you decide on the basis of that to investigate the reasons people have for doing a certain thing, and whether you think it's important to tolerate certain practices because of your understanding of why they exist. So tolerance is not entailed by relativism. That's the takeaway. Okay, so this brings us, I mentioned before, just to remind you, that with that first general argument for relativism, it's often assumed, premise 1 to premise 2, that differences in practices implies different moral codes, different basic values. And I raised a question as to whether that's true, because there are many factors that determine our practices, not just moral beliefs, but also beliefs about the way the world is, and who we are, and so on, and also physical circumstances, like in the Inuit case. So I wanted to make a case there for the possibility of some values having to be shared, having to be sort of independent of any particular culture or society at any time, that have to be shared in order for societies to exist or survive. Now, this is Poyman's starting point for defending objectivism. He wants to say, look, given what we are as a species, given our particular physical characteristics, genetic makeup, cognitive structures and tendencies, and given our abilities, given our vulnerabilities, given the world in which we live, the basic sort of geology and chemistry and physics of this world and so on, there are certain basic needs we have that necessitate our caring about some things, saying some things are good and some things are bad. So if we're going to retain the integrity of our physical bodies, we have to value an injunction against murder, and we have to value the protection of the vulnerable, including the young, and we have to we have to recognize that it's important everyone has enough to eat and to drink and has adequate shelter and potentially health care and so on. That it's understandable that people want to take care of themselves and their loved ones. We have to value communication and thus honesty, right? Communication is, social cohesion. Communication matter for us, are essential for us, given the kind of creatures we are. So if those things matter, if we need them, we have to have certain values. So the two go hand in hand. This is, I think, in many ways a compelling argument, and we can talk about what you think of it in class. But I do want to just finish by raising one question, which is, is this really an argument for a form of objectivism? Poyman himself admits that he's thinking about values as being relative to, if you like, humanity or humankind. He's looking at our contingent needs based on how we happen to be as biological creatures in this world. At least typically. Of course, there's variation between us. So he's making values relative to, on a sort of global human scale, but that rather than to individual communities within, individual human communities. He thinks he's still defending objectivism because what he's giving us is a standard of right and wrong that's independent of any particular culture at any particular time that we all can and should appeal to. But maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it. And there is another philosopher, well, not just one, but a reading I sometimes give my intro students in which his name is Gil Harman. He argues that, in fact, there can only be relativism. So this is worth keeping in mind. Although there does seem to be real alternatives between the kind of relativism or conventionalism that we first see Poyman taking up and what he's giving us at the end, even if we don't want to call it, strictly speaking, objectivism. All right, that's everything on this topic, objectivism and relativism. I will see you in class.